The 11th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Saturday at 6 p.m. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news. Once again, from the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, here is your host, Kathy Wyatt.
It is defined as taking positive steps to increase the representation of women and minorities in the areas of employment, education, and business from which they have historically been excluded. Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, affirmative action, and a petition circulating across the state designed to put an end to Nebraska's affirmative action programs. Joining us today to represent both sides of the issue are Tim Weiss, national speaker and author of Affirmative Action, Racial Preference in Black and White, and Dayton Headley, who is the state chairman for Nebraska College Republicans. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Tim, I think we're going to go ahead and start with you, and if you could give us a brief history of affirmative action.
There is no brief history. I mean, it depends on where you start. I actually would say you have an honest conversation about affirmative action. You have to go back to the colonies of what became the United States, because the first 350 years of affirmative action was for whites, and particularly white men, like myself. We never talk about it that way. We tend to think about affirmative action as being something that's only done for people of color or perhaps white women. And I think that's sort of historically dishonest. The reason that kind of affirmative action became necessary was because of the 350-year head start that whites had had, blatant racial preference only because of race, which was never corrected until we began to do affirmative action programs. Now, as far as what we normally think of as affirmative action, begins really in the mid-1960s, perhaps early 60s, and affects a few different areas. First, it affects contracting with government agencies, federal, state, and local. The idea is that institutions have to make good faith efforts to improve the representation of all groups in the community more equitably. So people of color, white women, sometimes states have people with disabilities or people over 40 might be included, just depends on the state. But the idea was that you have people who are highly qualified and yet they get overlooked in spite of their qualifications because of racial bias, because of gender bias, or because of the old boys networks, which might not necessarily be overtly racist or sexist, but which have the effect of perpetuating race and gender exclusion. In the early 70s, affirmative action was extended to colleges and universities. And what it said there was that particularly state institutions had an obligation to reach out to do race-conscious recruitment and to consider race in the process of admissions. What that means is that if I'm an admissions officer, I don't just look at grades and test scores, because we understand that grades and test scores are going to be affected and contingent upon prior opportunity. If certain people have had more opportunity because of better resources, in part because of race or economic status, admissions officers are being encouraged under affirmative action to think about that, to consider that, to make sure that their student bodies are diverse. So really what we're looking at the last 40 years of affirmative action was essentially premised on the notion that if you don't make a deliberate effort, you can't just say, we're going to throw open the gates of opportunity and good luck to you, because residual race and gender bias is still very much with us. The data, which I hope we'll get into in the course of the interview, still suggests that that rationale, which was so true 40 years ago, is still true today, some 40 years later.
How did you become interested in all of this?
Well, you know, for me personally, I started reflecting on the way that my family had received decades and generations of racial preference solely because we were white. The reality is, I started thinking when I was in college about the fact the only reason that I was actually able to go to Tulane University in New Orleans was because I was white. It was sort of indirect, but let me briefly sketch it out. Came from a family with very little money. Grew up in an apartment, 850 square foot apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, no savings, didn't have money for vacations, didn't have any money, but my mom was able to go to the bank and get a loan to be able to send me to Tulane when I happened to mess around and not get my financial aid forms in on time. That was my fault, but she was able to go down to the bank and get 10 grand or $12,000 to make it possible to bridge the gap between the financial aid they were offering me and what it was going to cost. Now you might say, well, why is that about race? Very simply, we were broke, but my grandmother wasn't. My mom was able to take my grandmother with her to the bank. My grandmother signed the loan or co-signed the loan for my mom so we could get the loan. You might say, well, what does it have to do with being white? Well, it has everything to do with it because my grandmother was able to put up as collateral her house, which means if I default on the loan, they can take her property. The only reason she had that house, like millions of white people in this country of her generation, was because being white, they were able to get government loans or mortgages from banks in neighborhoods that people of color could not live in, houses that they could not have owned. So had we not been white, my family wouldn't have had that house. Without that house, we don't get the loan to send me to Tulane. Without that, I don't get to meet the individuals who ultimately set me on this path to do the work I do. So in a very real sense, I started thinking about it in a different way than most, thinking about what's the white piece of affirmative action, and if I want to live in an equitable and fair society, what is my obligation to make sure that everyone has the same kinds of opportunities that I had. In my case, they were not about merit, they were not about me being the smartest kid, the best applicant at Tulane, or being the hardest working person. It was about being white and the advantages that came with that.
Interesting, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
Dayton, I want to get into the petition now, before we get too far into the rest of this. The petition that was filed in November. Tell us a little bit about that, and more importantly, the process that led up to that petition.
Mr. Connerly's group, the American Civil Rights Initiative, is planning the Super Tuesday for equality. It's going to be November 4th this year, Election Day. They targeted 5 states where they'd like to continue upon the successes they've had in California, Washington, and Michigan, and Nebraska is one of those states.
And what is your interest in this? Tell us why you are a supporter of.
I've always been interested in the issue of affirmative action. Never really paid attention to it until the 2006 elections in Michigan, where Proposition 2 was on the ballot. I really felt it was a cause worth fighting for, and I'm hoping to work with the Nebraska Civil Rights Initiative to really talk about this issue on college campuses, because we've seen since this petition has been filed, the entire university system in Nebraska has been in opposition to this. There's a lot of, both sides of the story aren't being heard, and I think groups like college Republicans and other groups can bring both sides of the issue to college campuses.
Okay, and you referenced it's a cause worth fighting for.
Yes.
What makes it so?
I think it's really a matter about ending discrimination on college campuses and removing racial and gender preferences from college campuses and from across the state of Nebraska in public institutions.
Okay, I do want to talk a little bit before I ask another question here. If you look at the name of this initiative, okay, the Nebraska Civil Rights Initiative is what you are calling this. In my understanding, it's going to remove affirmative action policies and programs which actually originated out of the civil rights movement. So how did this name come about, and can you clear up perhaps any confusion with the name there?
I'm not sure where the name came from, but it doesn't end affirmative action. It ends race and gender preferences in the state of Nebraska and public institutions. Affirmative action for socioeconomic and groups that are traditionally not involved is still allowed. It's only in public institutions in regards to race and gender preferences.
Well, it would end affirmative action as we know it. Affirmative action as we know it isn't about socioeconomics. That's called anti-poverty programs. It would end affirmative action recruitment that was deliberately targeted to race, for example. So colleges would not be able to say, you know, we need to really make a special effort to make sure that Native American students, Latino students, African American students, or whatever, are being brought into the school. And a lot of times you have to make that extra effort. What the research on this says is that you can't just say, oh, come one, come all, you're all welcome, because folks that are in marginalized groups, historically discriminated against and oppressed groups, don't always assume that they're welcome. Maybe they should, maybe it'd be great if they did, but they don't, because their experience with a campus, for example, or with a particular employer is different. They're not just going to assume that an employer is going to want to hire them. They're not going to assume that they're going to get a fair shot at the contract, because historically they haven't. So unless a deliberate effort is made to make sure that that pool is diverse and a deliberate race-conscious effort is made, that diversity won't come about naturally. And that would be ended under the initiative. Any race-conscious recruitment, any race-conscious effort, any consideration of race whatsoever, even considering what race means in terms of the quality of education, the experience that one is likely to have had, would be potentially on the chopping block. It's sort of vague, so we don't really know it. Sometimes it's up to the courts, but it could be interpreted to end every single policy that we currently think of as affirmative action. And the problem with it in every state where it's been done is that not once has Ward Connerly or any of the folks at his organization ever proposed an alternative to deal with the ongoing reality of race and gender discrimination. It's as if they're saying, yeah, it exists, and this is the thing we've been doing for years, and we're going to get rid of it. We're not going to have any alternative. We don't have an alternative plan. Tough luck. Good luck to you. Hope you don't, find yourself on the bad end of a discriminatory act. That's the problem. If one wants to criticize affirmative action, that's fine. But it seems that there's a moral and ethical obligation to propose an alternative, and that's not what happens with any of these initiatives anywhere they've been passed.
Well, a lot said there, and certainly want you to respond to that. Makes sense. I guess my first question is, do you think we're at a point now where, something like this could be introduced, or what is your thought overall to what Tim is saying?
I believe that poverty transcends race, and there's always going to be discrimination, but solving one injustice by creating another injustice doesn't really seem like the best deal. And this ending affirmative action is not really true. It ends affirmative action based on race and gender. Socioeconomic status, poverty, living rural and urban areas is still allowed. I don't think there's
But affirmative action was never a poverty program. This is the big misunderstanding. Affirmative action was never intended to lift people out of poverty. That's a totally different set of policies. Affirmative action was intended to address race discrimination against people not because they're poor, but because they're black, or because they're Latino, or because they're Asian, or because they're American Indian. It was intended to address gender bias against women, not because they're poor, but because they're women. The evidence on this is overwhelming. Studies from the last 5 and 6 years find that job applicants with white names, for example, are 50% more likely to get called back for an interview than applicants with black-sounding names, even when the qualifications are the same. How is socioeconomic affirmative action going to deal with that? It won't. That's race discrimination. And that says two things. One, that discrimination against black folks in this case is still very common. And two, that this notion of reverse discrimination, that somehow this is an injustice perpetrated against us white folks, is nonsense. If that were true, that study would have found that if having a black name would have gotten you the job. They would have thrown their arms open and said, hallelujah, Tamika has applied for the job. That doesn't happen. The research is overwhelming that being white still pays dividends in contracting. 93% of all government contracts are controlled by white male-owned businesses. What in the world? The 7% is not enough for the dominant group? It's sort of stunning to believe that we're actually considering affirmative action or so-called racial preference an injustice when the overwhelming lion's share of the best jobs, the best contracts, and by the way, when it comes to student admissions, whites are more likely than members of any other group to get into their college of first choice, even at elite schools, let alone at just larger state institutions, which are not always, elite sort of Ivy League type schools. So this is all based on misnomer and misunderstanding, and good people can definitely oppose affirmative action, but if they're going to, we need to at least have the discussion rooted in the facts of what it was intended to do and not blame it for not ending poverty or not act as if it were a poverty program. It's not that. It's about race discrimination. And it seems to me the burden is on the proponents of this to show that race discrimination is no longer a real problem. I've debated Ward Connerly before, and he even said back in 1994 in the California State Legislature that back in the day, 35 years ago, when discrimination was so rampant, this was a needed thing, that affirmative action, even racial preference, was necessary. Now he says it's not. Well, that's his burden to show that it's not. It's his burden to show that things have changed. The data that I'm suggesting to you is recent data. This isn't 30 years ago. These are studies about discrimination today. And so if discrimination justified it 35 years ago as a way to open up opportunity, it seems to me if discrimination still continues, it's still justified on the same rationale.
What's your response there, Dayton? It's a lot of information to...
It is a lot of information. I just say that it's more of a principle than anything where discrimination is wrong, whether it's a minority or a majority, and that whenever you're giving somebody a hand up, you're giving someone a hand down.
Would you have been opposed to affirmative action in 1965, 6, or 7, when right at the end of apartheid in this country? Would you have been opposed to it then?
Probably.
Okay, because Ward Connerly wasn't. And in fact, not only was Ward Connerly not, Ronald Reagan wasn't. Ronald Reagan, one of the last things he did as governor of California in 1974, the last month before he left office, was sign into law the affirmative action programs that Ward Connerly helped eliminate in 1996. Ronald Reagan, not some liberal governor, Ronald Reagan, and he said at the time, this was what he said, quote, "Time and experience have shown that laws of non-discrimination are not enough. Justice demands that each and every citizen consciously adopt and accentuate a real and personal commitment to affirmative action so as to make equal opportunity a reality." End of quote. In other words, what he was saying was it's not enough to just say run the race. You've had 350 years going back to the colonies of overt white supremacy, overt apartheid. We were a racially fascist state for 3.5 centuries. It's an inarguable historical point, though I know we don't like to use that kind of language in a country where to say that makes you supposedly unpatriotic, but it's true. And so if you have a 350-year system of racial fascism and apartheid, and then all of a sudden you say run the race, that's like having a race 8-leg relay where one of the teams is 5 laps ahead. And then they say, oh, well, we're going to take off the shackles that were on your feet those first 5 laps. Good luck. And then we're surprised when the folks with the head start still cross the finish line first. Shocking. You know, it's like having an intergenerational poker match where the white guys, you know, start the game and they cheat and they cheat. And every generation they pass the game down to their kids, and their kids cheat and their great grandkids cheat. And then 15 generations later, the white guy who's inherited the game says, you know, we really need to stop this cheating. It's been unfair, and my people did your people wrong, so we're going to stop cheating. No more cheating. We're going to play by one set of rules. But then they ignore the fact that they got a whole set of chips on their side of the table, and the black team over here has none. And then when the black folks say, yeah, maybe we want to talk about those chips, we go, oh no, that would be reverse discrimination. It's nonsense.
Dayton, okay, let's pretend for a minute that we're one-on-one, and there's no one else around, and you have this petition that you want to approach me about signing, okay? What are you going to say to me? Let's assume that I have the basic information in hand. What is it that you're going to say to me? How are you going to, because I want before the show is up, to make sure that people understand what it is that you are standing for in all of this. So if you have the petition in hand, and I have average knowledge about this issue, what are you going to say to me prior to my deciding on my own whether or not I want to sign?
I would say that there are a group of Nebraskans who are working together to eliminate race and gender preferences in the state of Nebraska. We're looking for your signature so that this can be put before the people of Nebraska on this November 4th, and let the people decide if this is what is in the best interest of the state of Nebraska.
And again, tell me why you believe that, based on where we are as a society now, why you believe this petition is in the best interest of Nebraska.
I think we've come a long ways as a country from being the white supremacist state that has been claimed, and we're seeing this in America with a woman and a African-American male being the leading contenders for president. It's not, we've come a long ways, and to say that we're some horrible state is completely wrong, and that it's time to move beyond race and work together to build a better nation.
So you believe we've come far enough. In your mind, you believe, when you look at some of the areas of interest here, I mean, I'm thinking of some of the progress that's been made here locally, not to mention statewide. You think we've come far enough that we are at a point where...
Definitely. There's always going to be bad cases and bad examples that skew the norm, but I think we have come a long ways as a nation.
The problem with this analysis is that, I mean, what is the evidence? 93% of government contracts in the hands of white male businesses. There are only 2 ways to interpret that. Either number one, there are still barriers to equal opportunity. That's my analysis. Mm-hmm. Or the only possible alternative is that you believe that white male contractors are just that much better, that they work harder, that they're smarter, that they're more capable. That's a fundamentally racist belief, and anyone who believes that is engaging in a fundamentally racist thought process. So if the problem is still unequal access, then we have to do something about it. Now, if it's not going to be affirmative action, so be it. It's got to be something else. By the same token, 85% of tenured faculty in this country are white men. 2 ways to spend that. Either one, they're just that much smarter and more scholarly, or women and people of color, male and female, haven't had equal access. If it's the latter, something has to be done about that.
So Dayton, if if we look at those numbers, for example, what would your response be to that?
I would say that affirmative action isn't being banned. It's being banned on the basis of race and gender, and that socioeconomic status is still allowed, and that those wrongs.
Well, poor people don't own businesses that they can get contracts with. That's a non sequitur. The point is 93% of the contracts go to white male-owned businesses, meaning people of color are being excluded. If you get rid of affirmative action on the basis of race, then that number will only get worse. I mean, that's how bad it is now with affirmative action. So imagine what happens if it's gone. And so this idea, and Ward Connerly said this a week and a half ago, said Barack Obama is proof that we don't need affirmative action. This is nonsensical. By that logic, if you can find individuals who are highly successful within communities of color, that means we don't need to do anything else. By that logic, in 1911, when Madam C.J. Walker became the first African-American millionaire in this country, we should have just said, well, glory be, we don't need civil rights laws, we don't need anti-discrimination efforts. Here we are, a white supremacist state, and this black woman's rich. That's nonsense. She became a millionaire in a year when 70 black people were formally lynched in this country. That doesn't mean anybody can make it. That doesn't mean that we should just say, good luck to you. By that logic, there have always been people in every oppressive system that did well and succeeded. We were, for hundreds of years, an overtly oppressive system. It's not something I'm claiming, by the way. It's something which is historically accurate. We've only begun to come out of that in the last 40 years. I am 39 years old. I was born the same year as the Fair Housing Act was passed. That was the last of the civil rights laws. So within my lifetime, it has been legal to discriminate against black people. Needless to say, just because it's illegal doesn't mean it stops. The data is clear on that. The study I mentioned to you, there have been several others. One that was a nationwide study done by the Alfred and Ruth Blumrosen at Rutgers Law School, found that on average, the estimate, it was a conservative estimate, they used a very limited definition of what constitutes discrimination. I would have used a broader one, but even using their definition, they were able to estimate that about 1.3 million people of color a year and 900,000 white females a year are the victims of race and gender discrimination when looking for a job. That's 1/3 of the time when those individuals are searching for a job, they will face discrimination on the basis of race and gender. That's today. That's not 10 years ago, that's not 20 years ago, that's not 50 years ago. To get rid of affirmative action on the basis of the two identities that are causing the injury is to make sure we can't ever do anything about that.
We are one of 5 states. Nebraska is one of 5 states where this is all being discussed right now. How, Tim, were those states selected? And we have a graphic up now that shows which states they are.
They were selected because there are a lot of white people. I mean, let's just be honest. They will never, Ward Connerly will never come to Mississippi with this. And what's the irony? Mississippi's thought of as one of the most conservative states in America. Indeed, but 35% of the voters are black. And he knows full well, if you come into the South, where I'm from, the part of the country which we think of as being historically horribly racist, and oh my goodness, there are too many black folks who know better who would stop it. So he goes to states where, interestingly, affirmative action does almost nothing. I mean, look at who has the jobs in state government here. Look who has the contracts in state government in Nebraska. Look at the racial makeup of the University of Nebraska. It is ridiculous to claim that people of color are taking anything away from white people in a state that's 94% white, where all the best jobs, or vast majority, are held by white males. It's ridiculous. Colorado, similarly, they're picking Arizona because of the resentment over immigration, largely thinking they can use that as sort of a catch-all, sort of building anger among people who think that they've got a grievance and they've been, put upon as white people. It's very calculated. They're not going to come into states with large numbers of people of color. If they went to California today and tried it, it wouldn't pass because the number of Latinos who are registered now is much more than 1996. They'll never go into a state that's that diverse again.
I'm glad you brought up those that have, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave.
I would say that he's been successful overwhelmingly. The initiative has in California, Washington, and Michigan. I'd say those 3 states are completely white and lacking minorities.
Oh, they're not. But California was much whiter in terms of its voting population 12 years ago.
But Dayton, what was their secret to success there, do you think?
It's that people believe this is right. As a large base of people, they believe that this is the right thing to do. And you get the establishment, both Republican and Democrats, in all 3 of those states oppose this, and it still passed with overwhelming support. So,
in spite of almost, overwhelming not almost, overwhelming opposition from every group of color. So what we're really talking about is an initiative which gets the support of conservative whites and some moderate whites, which are demographically enough to tip the balance. In every single one of those states, black folks were against the initiative by 4-1, Latinos were against the initiative by 3-1, Asians were against the initiative by 2-1, Native Americans were against it by 2 to 3-1. So it's what it is, it's a divisive initiative. By definition, the way that it is skewing, you have white folks who are enough of the numbers of voters to tip the balance. The vast majority of the different identity groups in each state are actually opposed to it. But if you pick a state where the voting population is mostly white, which is the case in each of those places, and overwhelmingly so, especially California in '96 was even whiter than it is now. You can win. You can win in states that are 90% white, 80% white, where the electorate is going to be white, because white folks have been fed, I think, a bunch of myths about affirmative action. That we believe it's quotas, we believe it's giving people things they're not qualified for. Quotas, on the other hand, have been illegal for 30 years. So anyone who believes that that's what affirmative action or quote unquote racial preference is wrong. They've been misled, and so when you mislead people, they'll go and vote for things. I don't think it's because they're a bunch of racists. I don't think it's because they're a bunch of sexists. There's certainly people like that. But I think it's more that we believe X, Y, and Z about affirmative action because for 25 years, that's what we've been hearing from a lot of very mainstream conservative commentators, from the President of the United States on down. That's the kind of stuff we've heard for 20 to 30 years. So naturally, that's what people have grown up with, and that's what they believe, even though it's not true.
And the objective here really is to help educate people on what's going on. Dayton, I know there's a website that people can go to if they want to learn more about the initiative. Do you want to share that with us?
I'm not officially a member of the organization. I believe it's NECRI. I'm not an official.
And we do have a graphic of that, so we'll go ahead and put that up. And you have a book, Tim.
I do.
You have about a minute to tell us about this book.
Well, I have a couple of books, but the one that you're referencing is the book I did on affirmative action 3 years ago. It's called Affirmative Action, Racial Preference in Black and White. It's a small book, about 192 pages, heavily footnoted, but still easy to read. I mean, it's academic, but not boringly academic. And the idea behind it was wanting to look at what racial preference really is. And so what I do is I point out not only the historic racial preference for whites, which we usually don't talk of in those terms, but also the ongoing evidence of discrimination as a way to make the case for affirmative action. I make both the offensive case and the defensive case. The defensive case is responding to the various conservative criticisms that people like Ward Connerly have launched. The offensive case is the case that says the whole history of this country is the history of affirmative action for white people. If we're going to have a fair and decent nation, if we're going to be the nation we claim to be and live up to our ideals, we have to have something to balance out that history, and that's what, at least in part, affirmative action is.
Okay. All right. Well, in closing, we really do want to wish a thank you to both of you. And talking about the affirmative action and the petition filed last November to end the state's affirmative action programs. The objective of today's show was not to sway our viewers in one way or another, but rather to give you enough information to make an informed decision in November. Hopefully we've done that. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at unotv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours. The 11th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Saturday at 6 p.m.